Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Brian Thatcher, and I'd like to welcome you to this series of Mercy Unbound. It's a series that aims to provide hope and avenue for healing, and one that will help you understand and then live the great mercy of God. With me today, I have Kimberly Cook. We're going to discuss her story and also the book she wrote, Motherhood Redeemed: How Radical Feminism Betrayed Maternal Love. We're going to have an interesting discussion, and this book is available at TAN Books, TAN Books, or at Amazon. But Kimberly, welcome to Mercy Unbound.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I guess let's just like to start off by asking, why did you write this book, and what were your goals in doing so?
Well, I felt compelled to write this book because I think a lot of young women had walked a journey similar to mine and probably even men as well. But for me, my journey led me to the feminist movement. And with that, it also led to a lot of harmful ideologies that I embraced about womanhood, about motherhood, about life, about the church. And it really formed all of my ideologies as an adult, into my early adulthood. And they were very destructive and harmful. And there was not a lot of life in those ideals that I held. And really, it resulted in a relativism. And I look around today and I see so many people that have just continued on with those beliefs that kind of got stuck where I was in my, late teens, early adulthood. And thankfully, I moved past that and I found something solid. I found the faith, I found the church. But I see a lot of people that never found that, even people that I knew from my past and was connected with. They're now adults and they're still floundering and they're still holding on to these very harmful ideologies. And so I just felt that, especially in the church, a lot of women needed to hear what I wanted to say in this book, the truth about feminism, the truth about the history of feminism, and the truth about where feminism is today and how it has really formed us to understand our maternity and our role as women in a way that is not in line with how Christ created us to be.
When we speak of relativism, there's different forms, but I think of the belief that there is no absolute truth. I define what is truth. If it's okay with me, then it's fine. And you mentioned relativism, and just briefly tell us about your early life and teenage years and then what happened.
Right. Well, that idea of relativism, which I think is so pervasive today, especially with young people, but those young people are becoming older and they're still, like I said, hanging on to those beliefs. It's no longer that relativism is a phase that you pass through when you're kind of in high school and grasping for the truth. So many people pass through that on their way to something solid. But now it's become just a way of life that people hold indefinitely throughout their life. And for me, we as a family fell away from the church when I was in middle school. We were raised Catholic, but loosely Catholic. We went to Mass on Sundays. We said grace before meals, but we didn't really know much about the church. And that's my parents included because they were poorly catechized as well. And so it was more of just a traditional thing that we did every Sunday. My parents believed it was the right thing to do, but there really wasn't any penetration of the church into our household or into the way that we lived or in our home. There was nothing specifically Catholic about the way that we lived. We didn't have any relationship or knowledge of the saints or of a lot of the teachings of the church or of the catechism or anything like that. And so eventually, my brother and I really became disillusioned by the whole thing. And we thought it was pointless. There were no roots for us in truth or in why we were doing these things. So when we started to challenge my parents on why are we going to church every Sunday? What's the point? how are these scripted prayers going to do anything for us or for our relationship with God? And, sit, stand, kneel, what's the point? This is all just looking more like idolatry. And, for my parents, again, they didn't really have that arsenal of truth. And really, a lot of the questions got them as well. And eventually, they became so sick of fighting with us. And without having that strong spiritual conviction themselves, they gave up. So we just fell away completely from the church, and going into high school, in a public high school, had a lot of very liberal teachers, a movement, hanging on to feminism. And that really, and a lot of my friends were agnostic or atheist, or maybe they loosely define themselves as Christian, but the same thing, it didn't penetrate into their lives. It didn't affect their choices or anything else like that. So mostly what a lot of my teachers and my friends and my peers were living was relativism, which means, whatever you be, and just don't judge me on what I'm doing, and just keep out of everyone's way, and, find your own truth, find your own happiness, as long as it doesn't offend someone else's, and as long as it allows for everyone to do what they want, and find their own happiness too. And so those 4 years. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
No, I was just going to say, you know, you can see it's like the perfect storm in a way over the years, the last several hundred years in our country, because women wanted to be treated more than just property. There was a parallel there between slavery and women. You're nothing but property. You have no rights. You can't own land. And so women like Susan B. Anthony the suffragettes were out there wanting women's rights, and certainly those were justified. But then it took on its own life of its own. You mentioned in your book that she said, Susan B. Anthony, when the mother of Christ shall be made the true model of womanhood and motherhood, when the office of maternity shall be held sacred, and when the mother shall consecrate herself, as did Mary, to the one idea of bringing forth the Christ child, then will the earth see a new order of men and women, prone to good instead of evil. Can tell us a little bit, let's go back in history, it's like the perfect setup, but kind of walk us through that in a way if you can.
Absolutely. So there is a lot of irony when you look at the feminist movement, and when you look at the early suffragettes and what they were fighting for. And as you mentioned, women were certainly fighting for a justifiable right to be treated as an equal citizen of this country, to be able to have rights to their children in marriage, to be able to have the rights to own property and the right to vote as American citizens who were contributing to society. They wanted those rights. And in a lot of ways, the early suffragettes saw women as contributors to society because of their femininity, because they were raising the next generation, because they were keeping these households afloat and strong, and because they were contributing to the moral fiber of the children. In a lot of ways, they were promoting the vocation of the housewife and the mother, and saying this is why women should have a role in society as far as voting, because they have such a strong role in raising the next generation. And they were really promoting that for women, and saying this should be recognized, this should be upheld. This is something that society will crumble without this foundation of what women are doing in, as our country takes form. And the women are at home, even though they're not in, the political offices or things like that. So Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the other suffragettes were really turning the eyes of people to recognize what women were contributing. And yet they weren't given any notice or any rights or any respect for that role. And yet you see, as much as the feminist movement wanted to basically uphold the rights of women, and that independence, you see, as it goes down through society and through the generations, women are basically undoing that for themselves and undoing the respect and the rights that these early suffragettes wanted for them. They're really undoing it for themselves. And that's something that you see over and over again, is extremely ironic. So I think it's interesting that you point to Susan B. Anthony and that quote, because I think that that's one that people are very shocked that it's Susan B. Anthony when they hear that quote. And she wasn't Catholic, but as Catholics, we certainly can see the truth in that, maybe even more than she could have. But the fact that this office of womanhood, this office of maternity, should be looked up to with the same amount of respect that we look up to the Blessed Mother, a model of that perfect womanhood, that perfect maternity. And this womanhood that artists paint and that poets write about and that people meditate upon for their whole lives, and that priests and nuns lay down their lives for, in imitation of this love of this mother of Christ. And yet they were saying that the way that women and the way that maternity and motherhood is being treated in society is so far from that, that it really reflects the problems that we were having in society.
So really, the reasons Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Cody Stanton were promoting why women deserved all these rights, the feminist movement has torn all those away. Am I interpreting that correctly? And they're destroying the very foundations for which Susan Anthony fought for women's rights.
In a lot of ways, yes. I mean, of course, the right to vote, the feminists of today wouldn't take that back or anything. And that's what Susan B. Anthony is primarily known for gaining. But the ideals that those early suffragettes stood on, namely the pro-life foundation and the family foundation, all of those elements that they stood on were so vastly different than where a lot of feminists stand today when they're talking about women's rights. And as I point to in my book, they're so far on a different plane that in today's day and age, you can't even argue women's rights, because women's rights automatically includes the right to abortion in the feminist movement. And also, we have another problem, and that's women's rights. What does a woman even mean today? Because that's not necessarily biological. That's something that you feel inside. That's something, you might be transitioning from a man to a woman and you're still considered a woman. You might be transitioning from a woman to a man and you're still in the in-between phase. So here we have such a different situation where we can't even define woman anymore. And the idea of rights has been so focused on abortion rights and everything surrounding that those have really largely been the two principles dominating the current day feminist movement, is the transgender movement and the abortion movement.
Now, as you just said, it's the term pro-abortion and feminism, they've also almost become synonymous. Can a woman, though, be feminine and pro-life?
So, of course, a woman is feminine, but as far as feminist, so if you consider yourself a pro-life feminist, you really have to use that caveat that you have to say, I'm a pro-life feminist, because that really puts you at odds with the term feminism. I almost think of it if someone says, I'm a pro-choice Catholic, because if you say you're Catholic, that automatically means that you are for life. You're open to life from conception to natural death. That is what it means to be a Catholic and to embrace Catholicism in its core beliefs and in its mission and in its truth. So if you were to say that you're a pro-abortion Catholic, you have to really say that as the definition, setting you apart from Catholicism. And honestly, it doesn't really make sense. You're really a house divided against itself. And so that's what I think of when someone says, I'm a pro life feminist, because feminism, from its foundation, which was the early 20th century, when they coined the term feminism and made feminism a movement. There wasn't anything formal. There were the suffragettes, and they were operating and moving towards the right for women to gain the vote. But then in the early 20th century, they coined the term feminism, and they really collaborated in a unified effort on what feminism was and how it was going to benefit women and what the principles of feminism were. And abortion, or at least contraceptive rights and voluntary motherhood, as Margaret Sanger termed it, those were the foundations of feminism in that early 20th century switch when you coined the term. So when we look back through history, it's not like there was this radical shift of feminism. Now, the suffragettes, many of them were pro-life, so you can argue that in the 19th century there was a difference there. But from the time that there was a formal feminism as defined as such, it's always been on the back of this idea of voluntary motherhood, that women should be able to control their own motherhood, and whether that's through contraceptive, whether that's through abortion, whether that's through any other means, women should be in control of their own motherhood, and it should be a voluntary thing. And there's always been this idea that it was a slavery, that they shouldn't have to be enslaved to their maternity, that being a woman was some kind of a curse because of our maternity. And until we found a way to free ourselves from that curse, we were really second class citizens, and we would never be able to be equal with men. And that's always been the goal.
I've, of course, familiar with Gloria Steinem, but who was Helen Gurley Brown?
So she took over for Cosmo, and she really changed it to be this racy magazine for women that promoted the single woman, and the single woman going into the workforce, having a full and exciting life, having an active sex life outside of marriage. And this was radical in the 60s and 70s, even, to have this be put out there into a magazine that was going into the homes of many housewives and just, doctors' offices and regular places, that you started to see for the first time this glorified idea of the single woman who is just, having flings here and there, having a worthwhile job that she's moving up the ranks in. She's wearing dresses and suits, and she's going to dinners and parties, and she's getting awards. And it kind of just painted this whole new idea of the single woman. And it really pitted women against the idea that had formerly prevailed, that, you wanted to remain chaste, and then you wanted to find a husband, and you wanted to get married and have that white picket fence, and to have that yard full of kids and the cat and the dog and that whole thing. She really rocked the boat entirely on that and said, no, that is not what I think a lot of women want or should want. And, she worked really hard to make that image glorified. She also wrote Sex and the Single Girl, which had the same appeal, and it was a book that became wildly popular. And I think a lot of women fell into that trap after looking at her example and, reading her book and constantly being influenced by Cosmo. They fell into that same trap that I don't need marriage. I don't need a stable relationship. I don't need children. I can at least spend, a good portion of my 20s or 30s just having fun flings and worrying about myself and my career and my own advancement. And, marriage can always come later.
You mentioned in your book that femininity has a hard time coexisting with masculinity. Can you share your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Well, especially if we look to right now where we are in society, it's almost impossible to say the word masculinity without putting toxic in front of it. And we've come to the point in society where we don't know what masculinity is outside of being toxic, because anything that has formerly defined a man, when we look back again at Plato and Aristotle and Saint August or Saint Thomas Aquinas, we see these definitions of manliness as patient, long suffering, in enduring things that are hard, going for something, even if it is challenging, even if it's mentally and physically exhausting. That is kind of this definition of what masculinity is. And again, it's not this macho, like you're at the gym, weightlifting, how much can you bench press, or anything else like that. But it's something to do with your moral courage and your virtue. And that was something that all of these ancient wise people from the past always told us that masculinity was. And on the other hand, there was effeminacy, which they talked about as something that was a moral weakness, giving in easily to things that are too hard, having almost an obsession with comfort. And again, if we look today, and you have that idea of the man who's 30, 40 years old, still living in his parents' basement, playing video games. He's afraid to kind of go out on his own. And it's kind of this joke that you see pervasive in society or in sitcoms or things like that. But the truth is that that is a model of effeminacy. And it's almost what I think that our society and what feminism feels more comfortable with, because the other idea of masculinity is so challenging to, I think, women and feminism, that it's hard to, I guess, exist in the same space, because again, there's this domination aspect of feminism. And so I do think a man who would be fully embracing that masculinity as defined by Thomas Aquinas, that could be really challenging to feminism. And, to a woman who's going against what she's called to be.
Well, especially, when you think of women being, quote, liberated and multiple of whatevers, and it goes against church teaching, but we get back to relativism, and if it's okay with me, it's okay, and leads us to just a ball of confusion, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
You also mentioned in your book Madame Restell, if I'm pronouncing it correct, and Simone de Beauvoir. Who are they? Can you walk us through that and their role in some of this?
So Madame Restell, a lot of people don't know about her, but she was the most prominent abortionist of the 19th century. And she was an abortionist that existed in New York and practiced for many years. And she was an immigrant to this country. And shortly after coming to this country with her husband and her baby, her husband died. And then she was remarried to another immigrant who was a free thinker, and he worked in publishing. And what happened was the two of them were really out to live that American dream, to get rich quick. And they realized that they could do this by embarking on their free thinking principles, which also included the idea of contraception, and that there needed to be some kind of population control. So they decided to start doing a compounding business, which would create early abortifacients and contraceptives and things like that. And they became so successful in doing this. So many women came to them to buy these different potions and things like that from them. And then they would come back to them again when these failed to produce an abortion. And then they would actually perform the abortion on these women. Now, neither Madame Restell or her husband, Charles Lohman, had any kind of medical expertise or knowledge in any way, shape, or form. they didn't even have, at least Madame Restell, a full education, a full and complete education in general, much less anything medical. So they basically made the overnight switch. She decided, okay, I'm going to be a physician. And the next day she started putting physician on the wall, and people started, coming to her as this physician. And she started to provide these abortions. And as they realized they could charge a lot more to rich people in New York than to poor people, so they started just basically providing services to the rich, because not only would they get the money, but they would also get coverage from them. Because when you had these wealthy New York families trying to hide these pregnancies, if she was to go to jail or be on trial, and if she was to start telling all and naming names, that would ruin their family name and drag their family name through the mud. So we see that even though she went to court and even to jail a few times, she got off easy. She got off on shortened sentences. She had cushy, things that happened to her when she was actually in the jail. She had like feather beds, and she was given really nice food and things like that. So basically, she mostly got slapped on the wrist whenever she had these scrapes with the law. And this was even when women died through, her services. And so Madame Restell, if you look up anything about her, and when I started to hear about her, I always heard of her as this heroine from the past, that she was this women's rights advocate, that she was this great woman from the past who had done so much for women. She was this pioneer for healthcare for women, and for adoption services, and like the first maternity home in New York. And all of this couldn't be farther from the truth. When you really look into her, it's just horrific. I mean, her maternity home was basically for the purpose of making money on both ends. The women would pay to stay at the maternity home, and then she would set up an adoption with another family who would pay her for the baby on the other end. So she would really be getting paid on both ends of this one woman situation. And a lot of times, as a threefold, she would convince the women, after they gave her the baby for adoption, to go into prostitution. And she would actually find a fit for them with certain New York gentlemen, so who would also give her a tip for that as well. So when you really look at, okay, this is a heroine of women's rights. This is someone who, right now, we have this clouded knowledge in history of who Madame Restell is. There have been plays about her, glorifying her. There's been articles written about how wonderful she was. And when I looked deeper, I said, no, 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 no. The record needs to be set straight on Madame Restell, because she is, too big of and too important of a figure of the 19th century. Specifically, if we're talking about feminism, we need to devote a pretty large portion of the book to who this person really was, because I think we see the face of her today. We see the face of her in Planned Parenthood. We see the face of her in so many areas of abortion, which are trying to be glorified as women's health care. But when you look deeper, it's Madame Restell all over again.
Yeah, yeah. I think of the scripture verse of that causes a lot of consternation. A lot of people don't want to touch it, when it talks about women be obedient to your husbands. And they're like, no way, not today. But they don't read the second part where it says, men, love your wife as Christ loved the church. Well, how much did Jesus love the church? He died for us. He died for the church. So it's a two-way street. This isn't just about the man pulling the woman around by the head of hair. And the man is to love his wife as Christ loved the church. And we are just kind of in a lost situation sometimes, I think. And contrast that when you go to the Old Testament. Tell us a little bit about the Bible, if you can, briefly, about Jezebel and Esther. I believe they were both queens, weren't they?
Yes. So when you look at Jezebel, so she married a Jewish king, and but he was disobedient to God. He had done what was bad in the eyes of the Lord. And then not only that, but he went and married this pagan princess, Jezebel. And when Jezebel became the queen, she really brought her paganism into his kingdom, into the church, and into that Jewish heritage that he was meant to preserve as king. And he really kowtowed to Jezebel. She wanted the temple to be made for Baal and to be made for other pagan idols. And he complied with that. He changed the temple into a pagan temple. He had these idols built and put into the temple, defacing the temple. And she also had all of the Hebrew priests killed and replaced with all these idolatrous priests of Baal. So what happened was Jezebel really kind of took the lead in bringing paganism into the heart of Israel, and from the top down, and really killing these people who were closest to serving the Lord. And that's really when we see Elijah enter into the picture. And Elijah challenges Jezebel, and he also predicts that there's going to be this drought upon the land. And but then on the same hand, Jezebel is so wicked that he actually fears her. And when she says she's going to kill him and find him and avenge the death of all of the pagan priests that she put in when he put an end to them, she was going to find him and kill him. He actually ran away from Jezebel. And the Lord said, what are you doing? And he said, I'm scared of Jezebel. So I think with feminists, they look at Jezebel and they don't see any of this horrible stuff that she was doing, the paganism, the fact that she had this terrible death that was predicted in scripture, that she was, put out of the window by her servants, and that she was trampled by horses and eaten by dogs. It's like we don't look at all of the curses that came upon Jezebel for starting harlotries and the different things that she did that were so offensive to the Lord. What feminists look at is the power that Jezebel wielded. The fact that she made the great and mighty Elijah, one of the Lord's greatest prophets, cower and hide from her in the desert. And that is kind of the spirit of Jezebel, this idea that it doesn't matter how you come to power, it doesn't matter how evil or what tactics you take to get there, and it doesn't matter what you do when you're in power, how evil and terrible that can be. The only thing that matters is the power itself, that you're in charge, that people are afraid of you, and that you call the shots. And so that is really ultimately that Jezebel spirit that we see. And you oppose that to Esther, Queen Esther, who, on the other hand, feminists don't like. And Margaret Sanger had a lot of bad things to say about Esther. But Esther replaced this disobedient pagan queen. And, Esther wasn't expecting, her life to take this path, that she would marry this pagan king, and she was a Jew. And then she would be in this pagan land, ruling over this pagan land as queen. And what happened was, when her people, the Jewish people in her kingdom, became in danger, she had to approach the king, which was not allowed, being unsummoned. And this basically meant a death sentence to her, and then probably a death sentence to all her people as well, because she wouldn't have been able to stop them from being killed in the first place. So what happened was, we look at Esther, who's often considered meek and mild and just going with the flow and kind of like this jellyfish through the Old Testament. But that is not true, because if you look at Esther, first of all, it was prophesied that she would come into the land and set her people free there. But at that time, Esther held a 3-day fast, prayer and fasting, and she asked all the Jewish people in the land to do the same. And then she took she went to prayer and asked the Lord's protection before going to basically this death sentence. And the king's anger was miraculously transformed, and Esther was saved. And so were all the Jewish people in the land were saved by her act of courage and by her prayer and her fast and her intercession. And not only were all the Jewish people spared, but also many pagan people converted to Judaism because of the example of Queen Esther. So she had such a phenomenal role in the Old Testament and such a phenomenal role in the Jewish heritage, if we look back at that. And so it's funny that when people look at Jezebel, she really is kind of this edgy feminist that people look up to. And yet Esther is seen as this meek and mild pushover who just kind of fell into this awkward situation and kind of played the damsel in distress to get her way. And that's how these two women are painted.
Isn't that not surprising? The upside down kingdom, um, the people who we think are the weakest and have some humility are the strongest. And I'm reminded of a movie years ago, Poseidon Adventure, when the boat was flipped upside down and the whole crowd was walking down to their death. And there were just a few people going against the grain who survived. And that's kind of the world today. We got to go against the grain. Kimberly, I want to thank you so much for joining us today on Mercy Unbound. And I'd encourage viewers to get Kimberly's book, Motherhood Redeemed, How Radical Feminism Betrayed Maternal Love. There's a lot of very interesting stories in here. And I think to understand this history better, we have to know the truth, because the truth will set us free. And we remember darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can. But thank you for being here today. And all of you, welcome to Mercy Unbound. You can have a podcast as well. And just encourage you to stay tuned and follow us each week. I'd love to speak to your church or conference, and support us if you can. And God bless all of you. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel for the video portion. The podcast can be heard at anchor.fm/Dr. Brian, Bryan Thatcher, Thatcher, and on all the major podcast forums. I would love to speak at your church or conference, and please consider supporting our efforts to spread the truth to a hurting world. Thank you again. And for more information, go to the website at drbrianthatcher.com.